Chapters 34 through 36 of Foul Play by Charles Reade and Dion Boucicault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 34. On the morning that followed this memorable night our personages seemed to change characters. Hazel sat down before the relics of the hut, 3 or 4 strings dangling, and a piece of network waving, and eyed them with shame, regret, and humiliation. He was so absorbed in his self-reproaches that he did not hear a light footstep, and Helen Wollaston stood near him for a moment or two, and watched the play of his countenance with a very inquisitive and kindly light in her own eyes. "Never mind," said she soothingly. Hazel started at the music. "Never mind your house being blown to atoms, and mine has stood," said he half reproachfully. "You took too much pains with mine." "I will take a great deal more with the next." "I hope not. But I want you to come and look at the havoc. It is terrible, and yet so grand." And thus she drew him away from the sight that caused his pain. They entered the wood by a path Hazel had cut from the seashore, and viewed the devastation in Terrapin Wood. Prostrate trees lay across one another in astonishing numbers, and in the strangest positions, and their glorious plumes swept the earth. "Come," said she, "it is a bad thing for the poor trees, but not for us. See, the place is strewed with treasures. Here is a tree full of fans already made. And what is that? A horse's tail growing on a cocoa tree, and a long one, too. That will make ropes for you, and thread for me. Ah, and here is a cabbage. Poor Mr. Welch! Well, for one thing, you need never saw nor climb any more. See the advantages of a hurricane." From the wood she took him to the shore, and there they found many birds lying dead; and Hazel picked up several that he had read of as good to eat. For certain signs had convinced him his fair and delicate companion was carnivorous, and must be nourished accordingly. Seeing him so employed, she asked him archly whether he was beginning to see the comforts of a hurricane. "Not yet," said he. "The account is far from even." "Then come to where the rock was blown down." She led the way gaily across the sands to a point where an overhanging crag had fallen, with 2 trees and a quantity of earth and plants that grew above it. But when they got nearer she became suddenly grave and stood still. The mass had fallen upon a sheltered place where seals were hiding from the wind and had buried several; for 2 or 3 limbs were sticking out, of victims overwhelmed in the ruin; and a magnificent sea lion lay clear of the smaller rubbish, but quite dead. The cause was not far to seek. A ton of hard rock had struck him, and then ploughed up the sand in a deep furrow, and now rested within a yard or 2 of the animal, whose back it had broken. Hazel went up to the creature and looked at it; then he came to Helen. She was standing aloof. "Poor bugbear," said he. "Come away. It is an ugly sight for you." "Oh, yes," said Helen. Then as they returned, "Does not that reconcile you to the loss of a hut? We are not blown away nor crushed." "That is true," said Hazel. "But suppose your health should suffer from the exposure to such fearful weather? So unlucky, so cruel, just as you were beginning to get stronger." "I am all the better for it. Shall I tell you? Excitement is a good thing. Not too often, of course, but now and then. And, when we are in the humor for it, it is meat and drink and medicine to us." "What! To a delicate young lady?" "Ay, to a delicate young lady. Last night has done me a world of good. It has shaken me out of myself. I am in better health and spirits. Of course I am very sorry the hut is blown down, because you took so much trouble to build it. But, on my own account, I really don't care a straw. Find me some corner to nestle in at night, and all day I mean to be about and busy as a bee, helping you and Breakfast! Breakfast! Oh, how hungry I am!" And this spirited girl led the way to the boat with a briskness and a vigor that charmed and astonished him. Souvent femme varie. This gracious behavior did not blind Hazel to the serious character of the situation, and all breakfast time he was thinking and thinking, and often kept a morsel in his mouth and forgot to eat it for several seconds, he was so anxious and puzzled. At last he said, "I know a large hollow tree with apertures. If I were to close them all but one, and keep that for the door? No, trees have betrayed me. I'll never trust another tree with you. Stay! I know! I know! A cavern!" He uttered the verb rather loudly, but the substantive with a sudden feebleness of intonation that was amusing. His timidity was superfluous. If he had said he knew "a bank whereon the wild thyme grows," the suggestion would have been well received that morning. "A cavern!" cried Helen. "It has always been the dream of my life to live in a cavern." Hazel brightened up. But the next moment he clouded again. "But I forgot. It will not do. There is a spring running right through it. It comes down nearly perpendicular through a channel it has bored or enlarged, and splashes on the floor." "How convenient!" said Helen. "Now I shall have a bath in my room, instead of having to go miles for it. By the by, now you have invented the shower bath, please discover soap. Not that one really wants any in this island, for there is no dust, and the very air seems purifying. But who can shake off the prejudices of early education?" Hazel said, "Now I'll laugh as much as you like, when once this scare is off my mind." He ran off to the cavern, and found it spacious and safe; but the spring was falling in great force, and the roof of the cave glistening with moisture. It looked a hopeless case. But if necessity is the mother of invention, surely love is the father. He mounted to the rock above, and found the spot where the spring suddenly descended into the earth with the loudest gurgle he had ever heard, a gurgle of defiance. Nothing was to be done there. But he traced it upward a little way, and found a place where it ran beside a deep decline. "Aha, my friend!" said he. He got his spade, and with some hours' hard work dug it a fresh channel and carried it away entirely from its course. He returned to the cavern. Water was dripping very fast, but on looking up he could see the light of day twinkling at the top of the spiral watercourse he had robbed of its supply. Then he conceived a truly original idea. Why not turn his empty watercourse into a chimney, and so give to one element what he had taken from another? He had no time to execute this just then, for the tide was coming in, and he could not afford to lose any one of those dead animals. So he left the funnel to drip, that being a process he had no means of expediting, and moored the sea lion to the very rock that had killed him, and was proceeding to dig out the seals, when a voice he never could hear without a thrill summoned him to dinner. It was a plentiful repast, and included roast pintado and cabbage palm. Helen Rolleston informed him during dinner that he would no longer be allowed to monopolize the labor attendant upon their condition. "No," said she, "you are always working for me, and I shall work for you. Cooking and washing are a woman's work, not a man's, and so are plaiting and netting." This healthy resolution once formed was adhered to with a constancy that belonged to the girl's character. The roof of the ruined hut came ashore in the bay that evening, and was fastened over the boat. Hazel lighted a bonfire in the cavern, and had the satisfaction of seeing some of the smoke issue above. But he would not let Miss Rolleston occupy it yet. He shifted her things to the boat, and slept in the cave himself. However, he lost no time in laying down a great hearth, and built a fireplace and chimney in the cave. The chimney went up the hole in the arch of the cave, then came the stone funnel, stolen from nature, and above, on the upper surface of the cliff, came the chimney pot. Thus the chimney acted like a German stove. It stood in the center, and soon made the cavern very dry and warm, and a fine retreat during the rains. When it was ready for occupation, Helen said she would sail to it. She would not go by land, that was too tame for her. Hazel had only to comply with her humor, and at high water they got into the boat, and went down the river into the sea with a rush that made Helen wince. He soon rowed her across the bay to a point distant not more than 50 yards from the cavern, and installed her. But he never returned to the river. It was an inconvenient place to make excursions from, and besides, all his work was now either in or about the cavern; and that convenient hurricane, as Helen called it, not only made him a builder again, it also made him a currier, a soap boiler, and a salter. So they drew the boat just above high water mark in a sheltered nook, and he set up his arsenal ashore. In this situation day glided by after day and week after week in vigorous occupations, brightened by social intercourse, and in some degree by the beauty and the friendship of the animals. Of all this industry we can only afford a brief summary. Hazel fixed 2 uprights at each side of the cavern's mouth, and connected each pair by a beam. A netting laid on these, and covered with gigantic leaves from the prostrate palms, made a sufficient roof in this sheltered spot. On this terrace they could sit even in the rain and view the sea. Helen cooked in the cave, but served dinner up on this beautiful terrace. So now she had a butt and a ben, as the Scots say. He got a hogshead of oil from the sea lion; and so the cave was always lighted now, and that was a great comfort, and gave them more hours of indoor employment and conversation. The poor bugbear really brightened their existence. Of the same oil boiled down and mixed with wood ashes he made soap, to Helen's great delight. The hide of this animal was so thick he could do nothing with it but cut off pieces to make the soles of shoes, if required. But the seals were miscellaneous treasures. He contrived with guano and aromatics to curry their skins. Of their bladders he made vile parchment, and of their entrails gut, catgut, and twine beyond compare. He salted 2 cubs, and laid up the rest in store, by enclosing large pieces in clay. When these were to be used, the clay was just put into hot embers for some hours, then broken, and the meat eaten with all its juices preserved. Helen cooked and washed and manufactured salt, and collected quite a store of wild cotton, though it grew very sparingly, and it cost her hours to find a few pods. But in hunting for it she found other things, health for one. After sunset she was generally employed a couple of hours on matters which occupied the fair in every situation of life. She made herself a sealskin jacket and pork pie hat. She made Mr. Hazel a man's cap of sealskin with a point. But her great work was with the cotton, which will be described hereafter. However, for 2 hours after sunset, no more, they rose at peep of day, her physician allowed her to sit and work, which she did, and often smiled, while he sat by and discoursed to her of all the things he had read, and surprised himself by the strength and activity of his memory. He attributed it partly to the air of the island. Nor were his fingers idle even at night. He had tools to sharpen for the morrow, glass to make and polish out of a laminated crystal he had found. And then the hurricane had blown away, among many properties, his map, so he had to make another with similar materials. He completed the map in due course, and gave it to Helen. It was open to the same strictures she had passed on the other. Hazel was no chartographer, yet this time she had nothing but praise for it. How was that? To the reader it is now presented, not as a specimen of chartographic art, but as a little curiosity in its way, being a facsimile of the map John Hazel drew for Helen Rolleston, with such out-of-the-way materials as that out-of-the-way island afforded. Above all, it will enable the reader to follow our personages in their little excursions past and future, and also to trace the course of a mysterious event we have to record. You'll find this on page 193. Relieved of other immediate cares, Hazel's mind had time to dwell upon the problem Helen had set him. And one fine day a conviction struck him that he had taken a narrow and puerile view of it, and that, after all, there must be in the nature of things some way to attract ships from a distance. Possessed with this thought, he went up to Telegraph Point, abstracted his mind from all external objects, and fixed it on this idea, but came down as he went. He descended by some steps he had cut zigzag for Helen's use, and as he put his foot on the 5th step, whoo, whir, whiz, came 9 ducks, cooling his head, they whizzed so close, and made right for the lagoons. Hum, thought Hazel, I never see you ducks fly in any other direction but that. This speculation rankled him all night, and he told Helen he should reconnoiter at daybreak, but should not take her as there might be snakes. He made the boat ready at daybreak, and certain gannets, pintados, boobies, and noddies, and divers with eyes in their heads like fiery jewels, birds whose greedy maws he had often gratified, chose to fancy he must be going a-fishing, and were on the alert and rather troublesome. However, he got adrift and ran out through North Gate with a light westerly breeze, followed by a whole fleet of birds. These were joined in due course by another of his satellites, a young seal he called Tommy, also fond of fishing. The feathered convoys soon tailed off, but Tommy stuck to him for about 8 miles. He ran that distance to have a nearer look at a small island which lay due north of Telegraph Point. He satisfied himself it was little more than a very large reef, the neighborhood of which ought to be avoided by ships of burden, and resolved to set some beacon or other on it ere long. He christened it Whitewater Island, on account of the surf. He came about and headed for the East Bluff. Then Tommy gave him up in disgust, perhaps thought his conduct vacillating. Animals all despise that. He soon landed almost under the volcano, and moored his boat not far from a cliff peaked with guano. Exercising due caution this time, he got up to the lagoons and found a great many ducks swimming about. He approached little parties to examine their varieties. They all swam out his way. Some of them even flew a few yards and then settled. Not one would let him come within 40 yards. This convinced Hazel the ducks were not natives of the island, but strangers, who were not much afraid, because they had never been molested on this particular island, but still distrusted man. While he pondered thus there was a great noise of wings, and about a dozen ducks flew over his head on the rise, and passed westward, still rising, till they got into the high currents, and away upon the wings of the wind for distant lands. The grand rush of their wings, and the off-hand way in which they spurned, abandoned, and disappeared from an island that held him tight, made Hazel feel very small. His thoughts took the form of satire. "Lords of the creation, are we? We sink in water, in air we tumble, on earth we stumble." These pleasing reflections did not prevent his taking their exact line of flight and barking a tree to market. He was about to leave the place when he heard a splashing not far from him, and there was a duck jumping about on the water in a strange way. Hazel thought a snake had got hold of her, and ran to her assistance. He took her out of the water, and soon found what was the matter. Her bill was open, and a fish's tail was sticking out. Hazel inserted his finger and dragged out a small fish which had erected the spines on its back so opportunely as nearly to kill its destroyer. The duck recovered enough to quack in a feeble and dubious manner. Hazel kept her for Helen, because she was a plain brown duck. With some little reluctance he slightly shortened one wing, and stowed away his captive in the hold of the boat. He happened to have a great stock of pitch in the boat, so he employed a few hours in writing upon the guano rocks. On one he wrote in huge letters, "An English lady wrecked here. Haste to her rescue." On another he wrote in small letters, "Beware the reefs on the north side. Lie off for signals." Then he came home and beached the boat, and brought Helen his captive. "Why, it is an English duck!" she cried, and was enraptured. By this visit to the lagoons Hazel gathered that this island was a half-way house for migrating birds, especially ducks; and he inferred that the line those vagrants had taken was the shortest way from this island to the nearest land. This was worth knowing, and set his brain working. He begged Helen to watch for the return of the turtle doves, they had all left the island just before the rain, and learn if possible from what point of the compass they arrived. The next expedition was undertaken to please Helen. She wished to examine the beautiful creeks and caves on the north side, which they had seen from a distance when they sailed round the island. They started on foot one delightful day, and walked briskly, for the air, though balmy, was exhilarating. They followed the course of the river till they came to the lake that fed it, and was fed itself by hundreds of little natural gutters down which the hills discharged the rains. This was new to Helen, though not to Hazel. She produced the map, and told the lake slyly that it was incorrect, a little too big. She took some of the water in her hand, sprinkled the lake with it, and called it Hazelmere. They bore a little to the right, and proceeded till they found a creek shaped like a wedge, at whose broad end shone an arch of foliage studded with flowers, and the sparkling blue water peeped behind. This was tempting, but the descent was rather hazardous at first. Great square blocks of rock, one below another, and these rude steps were coated with mosses of rich hue, but wet and slippery. Hazel began to be alarmed for his companion. However, after one or two difficulties, the fissure opened wider to the sun, and they descended from the slimy rocks into a sloping hotbed of exotic flowers, and those huge succulent leaves that are the glory of the tropics. The ground was carpeted a yard deep with their luxuriance, and others, more aspiring, climbed the warm sides of the diverging cliffs, just as creepers go up a wall, lining every crevice as they rose. In this blessed spot, warmed but not scorched by the tropical sun, and fed with trickling waters, was seen what marvels boon nature can do. Here our vegetable dwarfs were giants, and our flowers were trees. One lovely giantess of the jasmine tribe, but with flowers shaped like a marigold, and scented like a tube rose, had a stem as thick as poplar, and carried its 1,000 buds and amber-colored flowers up 80 feet of broken rock, and planted on every ledge suckers that flowered again and filled the air with perfume. Another tree about half as high was covered with a cascade of snow-white tulips, each as big as a small flower-pot, and scented like honeysuckle. An aloe 10 feet high blossomed in a corner, unheeded, among loftier beauties. And at the very mouth of the fissure a huge banana leaned across, and flung out its vast leaves that seemed translucent gold against the sun. Under it shone a monstrous cactus in all her pink and crimson glory, and through the maze of color streamed the deep blue of the peaceful ocean, laughing and catching sunbeams. Helen leaned against the cliff and quivered with delight and that deep sense of flowers that belongs to your true woman. Hazel feared she was ill. "Ill?" said she. "Who could be ill here? It is heaven upon earth. Oh, you dears! Oh, you loves! And they all seemed growing on the sea and floating in the sun." "And it is only one of a dozen such," said Hazel. "If you would like to inspect them at your leisure, I'll just run to Palm Tree Point; for my signal is all askew. I saw that as we came along." Helen assented readily, and he ran off, but left her the provisions. She was not to wait dinner for him. Helen examined 2 or 3 of the flowery fissures, and found fresh beauties in each, and also some English leaves, that gave her pleasure of another kind; and, after she had revelled in the flowers, she examined the shore, and soon discovered that the rocks which abounded here, though there were also large patches of clear sand, were nearly all pure coral, in great variety. Red coral was abundant, and even the pink coral, to which fashion was just then giving a fictitious value, was there by the ton. This interested her, and so did some beautiful shells that lay sparkling. The time passed swiftly, and she was still busy in her researches, when suddenly it darkened a little, and looking back she saw a white vapor stealing over the cliff and curling down. Upon this she thought it prudent to return to the place where Hazel had left her; the more so as it was near sunset. The vapor descended and spread and covered sea and land. Then the sun set, and it was darkness visible. Coming from the south, the sea fret caught Hazel sooner and in a less favorable situation. Returning from the palm tree, he had taken the shortest cut through a small jungle, and been so impeded by the scrub that, when he got clear, the fog was upon him. Between that and the river he lost his way several times, and did not hit the river till near midnight. He followed the river to the lake, and coasted the lake, and then groped his way toward the creek. But after a while every step he took was fraught with danger, and the night was far advanced when he at last hit off the creek as he thought. He hallooed, but there was no reply; hallooed again, and to his joy her voice replied, but at a distance. He had come to the wrong creek. She was farther westward. He groped his way westward and came to another creek. He hallooed to her, and she answered him; but to attempt the descent would have been mere suicide. She felt that herself, and almost ordered him to stay where he was. "Why, we can talk all the same," said she, "and it is not for long." It was a curious position, and one typical of the relation between them; so near together, yet the barrier so strong. "I am afraid you must be very cold," said he. "Oh, no. I have my sealskin jacket on, and it is so sheltered here. I wish you were as well off." "You are not afraid to be alone down there?" I am not alone when your voice is near me. Now don't you fidget yourself, dear friend. I like these little excitements. I have told you so before. Listen! How calm and silent it all is! The place, the night. The mind seems to fill with great ideas, and to feel its immortality." She spoke with solemnity, and he heard in silence. Indeed, it was a reverent time and place. The sea, whose loud and penetrating tongue had, in some former age, created the gully where they both sat apart, had of late years receded, and kissed the sands gently that calm night, so gently that its long, low murmur seemed but the echo of tranquillity. The voices of that pair sounded supernatural, one speaking up, and the other down, the speakers quite invisible. "Mr. Hazel," said Helen, in a low, earnest voice, "they say that night gives wisdom even to the wise. Think now, and tell me your true thoughts. Has the foot of man ever trod upon this island before?" There was a silence due to a question so grave, and put with solemnity, at a solemn time, in a solemn place. At last Hazel's thoughtful voice came down. "The world is very, very old. So old that the words ancient history are a falsehood, and Moses wrote but as yesterday. And man is a very old animal upon this old, old planet, and has been everywhere. I cannot doubt he has been here." Her voice went up. "But have you seen any signs?" His voice came down. "I have not looked for them. The bones and the weapons of primeval man are all below earth's surface at this time of day." There was a dead silence. Then Helen's voice went up again. "But in modern times? Has no man landed here from far off places, since ships were built?" The voice came sadly down. "I do not know." The voice went up. "But think." The voice came down. "What calamity can be new in a world so old as this? Everything we can do, and suffer, others of our race have done, and suffered." The voice went up. "Hush! There's something moving on the sand." 35. Hazel waited, and listened. So did Helen, and her breath came fast; for in the stilly night she heard light but mysterious sounds. Something was moving on the sand very slowly and softly, but nearer and nearer. Her heart began to leap. She put out her hand instinctively to clutch Mr. Hazel; but he was too far off. She had the presence of mind and self denial to disguise her fears; for she knew he would come headlong to her assistance. She said in a quavering whisper: "I'm not frightened, only very curious." And now she became conscious that not only one but several things were creeping about. Presently the creeping ceased, and was followed by a louder and more mysterious noise. In that silent night it sounded like raking and digging. 3 or 4 mysterious visitants seemed to be making graves. This was too much, especially coming as it did after talk about the primeval dead. Her desire to scream was so strong, and she was so afraid Hazel would break his neck if she relieved her mind in that way, that she actually took her handkerchief and bit it hard. But this situation was cut short by a beneficent luminary. The sun rose with a magnificent bound. It was his way in that latitude, and everything unpleasant winced that moment. The fog shivered in its turn, and appeared to open in furrows as great javelins of golden light shot through it from the swiftly rising orb. Soon those golden darts increased to streams of portable fire that burst the fog and illumined the wet sands. And Helen burst out laughing like a chanticleer, for this first break of day revealed the sextons that had scared her. 3 ponderous turtles, crawling, slow and clumsy, back to sea. Hazel joined her, and they soon found what these evil spirits of the island had been at, poor wretches. They had buried a dozen eggs in the sand, 1 dozen of which were very soon set boiling. At first, indeed, Helen objected that they had no shells, but Hazel told her she might as well complain of a rose without a thorn. He assured her turtle eggs were a known delicacy, and very superior to birds' eggs; and so she found them. They were eaten with the keenest relish. "And now," said Helen, "for my discoveries. First, here are my English leaves, only bigger. I found them on a large tree." "English leaves!" cried Hazel, with rapture. "Why, it is the caoutchouc!" "Oh, dear!" said Helen, in a disappointed tone. "I took it for the India rubber tree." "It is the India rubber tree; and I have been hunting for it all over the island in vain, and using wretchedly inferior gums for want of it." "I'm so glad," said Helen. "And now I have something else to show you, something that curdled my blood; but I daresay I was very foolish." She then took him half across the sand, and pointed out to him a number of stones dotted over the sand in a sort of oval. These stones, streaked with sea grass and encrusted with small shells, were not at equal distances, but yet, allowing for gaps, they formed a decided figure. Their outline resembled a great fish, wanting the tail. "Can this be chance?" asked Helen. "Oh, if it should be what I fear, and that is savages!" Hazel considered it attentively a long time. "Too far at sea for living savages," said he, "and yet it cannot be chance. What on earth is it? It looks druidical; but how can that be? The island was smaller when these were placed here than it is now." He went nearer, and examined one of the stones. Then he scraped away the sand from its base, and found it was not shaped like a stone, but more like a whale's rib. He became excited, went on his knees, and tore the sand up with his hands. Then he rose up, agitated, and traced the outline again. "Great Heaven!" said he. "Why, it is a ship!" "A ship?" "Ay," said he, standing in the middle of it. "Here, beneath our feet, lies man, with his work and his treasures. This carcass has been here for many a long year; not so very long, either. She is too big for the 16th century, and yet she must have been sunk when the island was smaller. I take it to be a Spanish or Portuguese ship, probably one of those treasure ships our commodores and chartered pirates and the American buccaneers used to chase about these seas. Here lie her bones and the bones of her crew. Your question was soon answered. All that we can say has been said; can do has been done; can suffer has been suffered." They were silent, and the sunk ship's bones moved them strangely. In their deep isolation from the human race, even the presence of the dead brought humanity somehow nearer to them. They walked thoughtfully away, and made across the sands for Telegraph Point. Before they got home, Helen suggested that perhaps, if he were to dig in the ship, he might find something useful. He shook his head. "Impossible. The iron has all melted away like sugar long before this. Nothing can have survived but gold and silver, and they are not worth picking up, much less digging for. My time is too precious." "No, you have found two buried treasures to day: turtles' eggs, and a ship, freighted, as I think, with what men call the precious metals. Well, the eggs are gold, and the gold is a drug. There it will lie for me." Both discoveries bore fruits. The ship, Hazel made a vow that never again should any poor ship lay her ribs on this island for want of warning. He buoyed the reefs. He ran out to Whitewater Island and wrote an earnest warning on the black reef, and this time he wrote with white on black. He wrote a similar warning with black on white at the western extremity of Godsend Island. The eggs, Hazel watched for the turtles at daybreak, turned one now and then, and fed Helen on the meat or its eggs, morn, noon, and night. For some time she had been advancing in health and strength; but when the rains declined considerably, and she was all day in the air, she got the full benefit of the wonderful climate, and her health, appetite, and muscular vigor became truly astonishing; especially under what Hazel called the turtle cure, though indeed she was cured before. She ate 3 good meals a day, and needed them; for she was up with the sun, and her hands and feet never idle till he set. 4 months on the island had done this; but 4 months had not shown those straining eyes the white speck on the horizon, the sail so looked and longed for. Hazel often walked to the island by himself; Not to explore, for he knew the place well by this time, but he went his rounds to see that all his signals were in working order. He went to Mount Lookout one day with this view. It was about an hour before noon. Long before he got to the mountain he had scanned the horizon carefully as a matter of course, but not a speck. So when he got there he did not look seaward, but just saw that his flagstaff was all right and was about to turn away and go home, when he happened to glance at the water, and there, underneath him, he saw a ship standing toward the island. 36. He started and rubbed his eyes and looked again. It was no delusion. Things never did come as they are expected to come. There was still no doubtful speck on the horizon, but within 8 miles of the island, and in this lovely air that looked nearly close, was a ship under canvas. She bore southeast from Mount Lookout, and south-southeast from the east bluff of the island, toward which her course was apparently directed. She had a fair wind, but was not going fast, being heavily laden and under no press of sail. A keen thrill went through him, and his mind was a whirl. He ran home with the great news. But even as he ran a cold, sickly feeling crawled over him. That ship parts her and me. He resisted the feeling as a thing too monstrous and selfish, and resisted it so fiercely that, when he got to the slopes and saw Helen busy at her work, he waved his hat and hurrahed again and again, and seemed almost mad with triumph. Helen stood transfixed. She had never seen him in such a state. "Good news!" he cried. "Great news! A ship in sight! You are rescued!" Her heart leaped into her mouth. "A ship!" she screamed. "Where? Where?" He came up to her, panting. "Close under the island, hid by the bluff, but you will see her in half an hour. God be praised! Get everything ready to go. Hurrah! This is our last day on the island." The words were brave and loud and boisterous, but the face was pale and drawn, and Helen saw it, and though she bustled and got ready to leave, the tears were in her eyes. But the event was too great to be resisted. A wild excitement grew on them both. They ran about like persons crazed, and took things up and laid them down again, scarcely knowing what they were doing. But presently they were sobered a little, for the ship did not appear. They ran across the sands where they could see the bluff. She ought to have passed that half an hour ago. Hazel thought she must have anchored. Helen looked at him steadily. "Dear friend," said she, "are you sure there is a ship at all? Are you not under a delusion? This island fills the mind with fancies. One day I thought I saw a ship sailing in the sky." "Ah!" She uttered a faint scream, for while she was speaking, the bowsprit and jib of a vessel glided past the bluff so closely they seemed to scrape it, and a ship emerged grandly and glided along the cliff. "Are they mad," cried Hazel, "to hug the shore like that? Ah, they have seen my warning." And it appeared so, for the ship just then came up in the wind several points, and left the bluff dead astern. She sailed a little way on that course, and then paid off again, and seemed inclined to range along the coast. But presently she was up in the wind again, and made a greater offing. She was sailed in a strange, vacillating way; but Hazel ascribed this to her people's fear of the reefs he had indicated to all comers. The better to watch her manoeuvres, and signal her if necessary, they both went up to Telegraph Point. They could not go out to her, being low water. Seen from this height, the working of this vessel was unaccountable. She was to and off the wind as often as she was drunk herself, or commanded by a drunken skipper. However, she was kept well clear of the home reefs, and made a good offing, and so at last she opened the bay, heading northwest, and distant 4 miles, or thereabouts. Now was the time to drop her anchor. So Hazel worked the telegraph to draw her attention, and waved his hat and hand to her. But the ship sailed on. She yawed immensely, but she kept her course, and when she had gone a mile or two more, the sickening truth forced itself at last upon those eager watchers. She had decided not to touch at the island. In vain their joyful signals. In vain the telegraph. In vain that cry for help upon the eastern cliff. It had saved her, but not pleaded for them. The monster saw them on the height, their hope, their joy, saw and abandoned them. They looked at one another with dilating eyes, to read in a human face whether such a deed as this could really be done by man upon his fellow. They uttered wild cries to the receding vessel. Vain, vain, all was in vain. Then they sat down stupefied, but still glaring at the ship, and each at the same moment held out a hand to the other, and they sat hand in hand. All the world to each other just then, for there was the world in sight abandoning them in cold blood. "Be calm, dear friend," said Helen, patiently. "Oh, my poor father!" And her other hand threw her apron over her head, and then came a burst of anguish that no words could utter. At this Hazel started to his feet in fury. "Now may the God that made sea and land judge between those miscreants there and you." "Be patient," said Helen, sobbing. "Oh, be patient." "No, I will not be patient," roared Hazel. "Judge thou her cause, O God! Each of these tears against a reptile's soul." And so he stood glaring, and his hair blowing wildly to the breeze, while she sighed patiently at his knee. Presently he began to watch the vessel with a grim and bitter eye. Anon he burst out suddenly: "Aha! That is right. Well steered. Don't cry, sweet one. Our cause is heard. Are they blind? Are they drunk? Are they sick? I see nobody on deck. Perhaps I have been too God forgive me, the ship's ashore." End of chapters 34 through 36.